Okay, guys, thank you for joining in and welcome to the Resistance United Great Britain and family. And we have back our friend William Gairdner, and we are going to discuss again another chapter from the book, The War Against the Family. But more importantly, thank you for coming, and I hope that everything is okay with you. It's very nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. So before we go into the chapter, I would like for you to give us a quick update about the recent events, the convoy, and the response of the government in Canada. Anything you can share to us about that?
Sure. Happy to. As I say, I suspect I have a minority opinion. I'm not sure. Because there's much confusion surrounding these things. But even some of my very close friends, who are perhaps a bit more libertarian than I am, have expressed concern about my interpretation of the event. However, that's even true for some of my adult children, who went out and stood on the bridges and waved at the truckers as they went by and did all that sort of thing. Dad, they said, why are you saying what you're saying? And I said, well, I have a bit more of an historical perspective on these things, perhaps, just perhaps, than you do. So that's why I'm going to share these thoughts with you. First of all, what's called the Truckers' Convoy, or a Freedom Convoy, as it came to be known in Canada, began almost the moment after our Prime Minister, Trudeau, passed a law basically blocking truckers from going back and forth across the border unless they were vaccinated. Well, so the first problem I had when this mutated into something besides a protest against vaccination was that they had an economic interest in going back and forth across the border. And they saw that this was threatened immediately by such a law. And never mind the fact that not very long after that, the Americans passed exactly the same law, forbidding American truckers to go back and forth across the border with Canada. By that time, it was out of the gate. And the truckers were organizing a protest drive to Ottawa, which is our capital city. Now, maybe it wouldn't have amounted to much if they decided to occupy a small village somewhere or another town. But the fact that they chose the capital city of the country brought a whole lot of symbolic significance to their action. And as I said to my adult children, when the convoy began, they were protesting against forced vaccinations, whatever. And actually, no one ever forced vaccinations on anybody in Canada. What they did was they made your life bloody miserable if you weren't vaccinated. So the kind of things they were doing were negative, not positive. Nobody was breaking down the door of your house, thank God, pinning you to the ground and jabbing you with a needle. However, they were saying things like, if you don't have these vaccinations, you can't take your kids into the hockey rink, you can't eat in restaurants, you can't participate in, hundreds of things which made life enjoyable and normal for everybody. So that's one view of the situation. Canada did not cross the line from negative to, I say positive in the sense of action, physical action, actually strong-arming people to take vaccines. But they made life pretty miserable for them, and this drove lots of people, like my wonderful daughter. I have 3 daughters, but this one in particular got very articulate about it. She actually decided to lie. She got her hands on a fake vaccination form, and because with 5 children, she was going absolutely crazy and not being able to take them anywhere or do anything. And their lives were being terribly impacted by this. And she did not, she's a wonderful woman. She did not feel good about lying. But I guess the way the equation goes, and everybody knows this is how it goes in so many walks of life, you figure they're lying. They're not giving me the truth about the numbers and the vaccines and the mixed results we're getting from them. So if they can lie, I can lie. That's my only way of fighting back. I think that was the way the kind of logic went. Anyway, back to the situation. The convoy is leaving the border, and they're driving to Ottawa. And I'll tell you, they weren't an hour into this thing before their protest against mandates and vaccines, which many people agree with. I mean, I don't like what's going on either. And I thought the government had been heavy-handed in all this. But they weren't an hour out of the gate before suddenly it wasn't freedom from mandates and freedom from vaccines. It was freedom in the abstract, freedom, everybody yelling freedom. And I think one of the most dangerous things in our history, the history of the West, if not in all countries, has been the transformation of concrete into abstract freedom. Because once it becomes an abstraction, what you fill it with is your own will. You decide what it is you want to be free with or of or for, and it's your will that makes this decision. That's a long way from a concrete objection to a vaccine or a passport, a vaccine passport. I think you would agree. But by the time they got to Ottawa, like a day or so later, that's the position they were at. This was a general revolution against all government in the name of freedom. Now, I realize some of those truckers did not go that far. They just stuck with the original objection. But many of them were getting a little headstrong and inebriated on the idea of freedom itself as a concept. It made me think of that movie Braveheart. You may remember it. Just at the end, before he dies, he shouts out, and everybody is just thrilled to it because the Scots really wanted to be freed from the English. So he's just ready to get his head chopped off, the poor guy. And he yells out, freedom! And everybody in the audience is thrilled by that cry. And I'm not saying it's not a meaningful cry. I just didn't like what one of my colleagues here called mission creep, where the mission changed from a concrete, easily identifiable objective into a general concern with government power and rule. So what happened when they got to Ottawa? We have rules about protesting, just like most countries do. And they basically boil down to things like, don't block the streets, at least not for more than a day or a few hours. Don't do this, don't do that. And everybody knows and encourages protest. I do. If I'd been the prime minister, I would have invited them into the House of Commons and said, come in, air your views. Let's hear what you have to say. But he didn't do that. In fact, he ran off and hid in his cabin at the lake somewhere on the phony excuse that his kids had COVID or something like that. And therefore, he didn't want to, expose himself. But the long and short of it is, he did not act in a very prime ministerial way. And this just inflamed things even more. So the protesters started saying, and this was their mistake, I think, they didn't say we're going to stay here for a couple of days and make our concern known and leave. They said, we're not leaving. We're not leaving until you drop the mandates and the passports and all the rest of it. In other words, they declared war on the government, a war of principle. Although I should say also that in Alberta, where they were blocking one of the main roads from the province of Alberta to America, the police pulled a truck over that was pulling a trailer. And in the trailer, they found some very serious arms, M15 rifles, body armor, gas masks, I don't know, that kind of thing. They obviously went there ready for a fight. And if the police had not discovered this cache of arms and captured it and taken them into custody, there might have been a fight and lives would have been lost. And what began as a peaceful protest would have mutated into something far more dangerous. That was Alberta. Never mind the fact that they also blocked the Ambassador Bridge from Windsor, Canada, into Detroit. Now, the Ambassador Bridge, you block that, and you're blocking, get this, $500 million of trade every day. So $500 million of trade got stopped for about, 10 days, 2 weeks. I can't remember the exact amount of time, but it wasn't nothing. And as a result of that, many of the factories, large and small, on the Canadian and American side of the border, had to lay off workers, go to shift work, or just lay them off until this thing ended. Lots of people like my own son who's got a startup going. He's building beautiful carbon fiber bike frames and things like that. It's really something what he's doing, but he needs parts, and a lot of them were getting shipped across the Ambassador Bridge, and he didn't have them. So it wasn't like the protest was not harming anybody else. And I'll just dwell a bit further on that. In Ottawa itself, they parked illegally. They jammed the streets around the capital. Ordinary citizens who lived there couldn't drive, and many of them were afraid to walk, especially, you can imagine, with a mask on, because they almost got beat up. I'm not saying anybody did, but they were frightened of getting beat up, and it was threatened to quite a few of them. So they just stayed home. Meanwhile, the truckers decided to make themselves known by honking their horns. Well, if you've ever been near a truck horn that's honking, you better put earplugs in, or you're going to go deaf for a long time. Well, they decided not just to honk the horn like they did when they were passing under the bridges on the way. They decided to lean on those horns 24/7, night and day. And, if you see 50 or 60 trucks, all who have their horns going night and day, you're not going to sleep. There's chaos everywhere. And the ordinary citizens of Ottawa got really upset with them. And so I don't think Trudeau knew what to do, because he did have a police force in Ottawa, but not enough police. And if the way Canada works, if he brought police in from surrounding towns, some of them, a few hundred miles away, he had no way of deputizing them to make sure that they were falling under the same authority as Ottawa police. So in a way, he had to pass the Emergencies Act so that he could kind of deputize them all at the same time and have all the police from different parts of Ontario cooperating. So that's what he did. And of course, this begged the question: had Canada just crossed the line from a soft totalitarian into a hard totalitarian state? And by the way, I'm just now putting together some research and thoughts of my own on that question. I don't like to see the word totalitarian bandied about without good reason. And often there is good reason. And it's arguable that Canada is closer to being a totalitarian state today than it was, say, 50 years ago, for sure. Speech control, human rights tribunals, pay equity systems, woke vigilance by the governments on all the citizens, and all this kind of thing. These are forms of cultural and psychological control of citizens we never saw in the past, except for in some very rare situations when governments had to, get into control of the population perhaps for something like the measles vaccination thing, against which, by the way, there were a ton of protests, just like there are against COVID. If you look in the film archives, you'll see all kinds of police beating up people on the streets in Canada and America and elsewhere, because governments were really trying to get rid of measles, which, by the way, they eventually did. Measles doesn't really exist anymore. Maybe it's hiding under a banana leaf somewhere or on the back of a monkey, I don't know. But you don't hear of anybody getting measles anymore. So it kind of got eradicated. Did I say measles? I'm sorry, it was smallpox that I was meaning to mention. So smallpox got eradicated by governments who were promoting vaccines that a lot of people did not want to take. Whether there's a lesson in that, I don't know. And I can't say because I'm not a medical expert, but the long and short of it is the Ottawa situation was not as sweet and wonderful as it sounded like, even though many of us thrilled to the idea of ending these damn mandates and stupid passports and masks. I always say, if you're going to spit on somebody or cough or sneeze, a mask is a good thing to wear. But otherwise, it does no good. I mean, because the air you breathe has to go in and out of the mask. So maybe instead of going forward as much as it might, when you breathe normally, it goes up, down, sideways, and all that kind of thing. But it basically does not stop your breath. If your breath, say, is infected, it doesn't stop it from getting to the next guy if he's reasonably close. And yet, I think I mentioned this on one of our past sessions. I used to have a cottage up north, and the last time I was there, when I was leaving the marina in my boat to go down this river to the open lake, there was this guy going by in his own little speedboat with a mask on, all by himself. And I thought, this is crazy. I mean, what does he really think he's doing, Well, he's not thinking. He's just following orders, a guy in a boat with a mask. But if you go to downtown Toronto, and my wife did when I was at the hospital last week, we saw all sorts of people walking around the sidewalks by themselves with masks on. And nobody in sight, and driving their cars alone with masks on. So it's really a psychiatric question, how far people take these things, I think. But anyway, I've talked enough about Ottawa. Okay. And I told my historian friend this morning, he's a wonderful historian of British history, who doesn't like Trudeau at all, and most people don't. I don't. I never liked his dad. And his dad was a huge target for me in my first very big best-selling book called The Trouble with Canada, which you can see right behind my head. That's the kind of a poster or a cover of the book that I framed. But that book sold about 50 or 60,000 copies in a small country like this. And his dad, the Prime Minister's dad, was my main target in the first part of the book. And now we got his damn son up there. His son's a former high school drama teacher. And honestly, everything he does has to be dramatic. So, when the truckers came to town, he walked off the stage. That was sufficient drama, he figured, I guess. But finally, he came back. And I told Ian this morning, I said, listen, don't laugh at me or say that I'm crazy. But future historians, when they're tallying up the duties of a government to protect its own government buildings, protect its own staff, and keeping in mind that only 2 years ago, some guy ran into the Canadian Parliament with a gun, and the sergeant at arms, as we call him in this country, has an official position to protect the House of Commons. He shot the guy. So he shot him right in the House of Parliament. And that was just one guy. But I said to Ian, okay, the truckers were really revved up emotionally on the notion of abstract freedom as opposed to concrete freedom like masks and things. It had already gone way beyond that. All they had to do was start a little drinking or pass a little drugs around. And it would have been really easy to imagine 10 or 15 of these burly, big, strong truckers marching into our Parliament building, House of Commons, and telling everybody to get the hell out, we're taking over. Now, that's not as far-fetched as you might think. In fact, it happens in a lot of countries. It happened in England itself during the English Civil War, when Cromwell and his so-called New Model Army basically closed the Parliament and told the parliamentarians to go home. We're in charge now. And they did. And my friend Ian wrote a wonderful book about it called The New Model Army, which I recommend to anyone interested in the English Revolution, which, by the way, was a sort of template for the French. They kind of saw themselves as imitating the English Revolution of the 1640s when they did their French Revolution so much later. Anyway, what I was saying to my friend Ian was, I think the government had reason to believe that violence was not there, maybe, but quite possible. And they have a duty to protect the symbolic center and heart of the nation. And they brought in the Emergencies Act to make that possible. And it may be, and I said, don't laugh, it may be that down the road, someone will say that this flaky drama teacher, no guts, woke prime minister that we have actually against his own instincts, because he never wanted to be typified as, I hate the word, but right winger, or a conservative or anything like that. He was always a man of the left, just like his dad. And so I think that's why it took him a while to act. He did not want to do that, but finally he did it. And future historians may say that it was the only statesmanlike thing he did in his tenure. So my friend Ian said, come on, what do you mean? I said, well, if you think about it, think about those guns in Alberta that were taken there to be used, and think about the shooting in Parliament only 2 years ago, and the fact that 15 years ago, the Toronto 19, as they were called, were a group of rebels who actually published their desire to invade the House of Commons and decapitate the Prime Minister. Fortunately, they were discovered and captured before they ever got around to that. But it's not like governments should sit around and wait until it happens. They do have to take preemptive action, sometimes on the basis of not very many facts. Now, I think what surprised people who ran around accusing of Trudeau Jr. of being a totalitarian was that nine days later, he lifted the act, and the act was taken away. Well, in a real totalitarian country, when you bring in acts like that, you don't take them away. They stay. But in Canada, God bless our system, he said, okay, we got done what we needed to do. We needed to shut it down, tow away the trucks, make life livable again for these residents of Ottawa. Then he lifted the act. So it's no longer in force. I'm sorry I've gone on too long about this, but it really was a fascinating situation from many points of view.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the update and for your take on it. It's I see what you mean. There was a trespass against the people who are living there and against the how do you call it? Trade lines, supply lines. Everything was affected. Yeah. Yes. So I understand that part of the position. But we are here for the main dish, which is to go back to the war against the family. So let's go back to the book if possible.
Yes. Well, I think what we're going to talk about today, originally I thought, how are we going to do this? Because I did it, making your case in a book is one thing. Defending it substantially with statistics or numbers is another. So I thought to myself, I've got to do some work here and try to find out in a graphic sense what's been going on with the family in my country. And so I hired an economist and gave him instructions to go find me this and go find me that. Cost me $5,000, but it was worth it at the time. And he was very good, and I'm going to show you some of the charts that he put together for me as we go along. But maybe I'll just start by saying that statistics, as everybody knows, you can lie with statistics. And I'm just going to read a bit from the first part of the chapter, if I could. So, and the confusion that statistics cause is not really surprising, perhaps, when you stop to consider that all human knowledge tends to get skewed in an opportunistic direction, especially, it seems, in family studies, which is what my book is about. After all, everything in life and in scholarship is a matter of attitude, much like deciding whether a glass of wine is half full or half empty. Everyone's heard that question, is it half full or half empty? Well, I decided if you want more wine, it's half empty. If you've had enough wine, it's half full. So it's about your attitude towards the half full or half empty glass. Now, in all the physical sciences, there are raw measurements, and then there are interpretations of those measurements. But in the soft social sciences, researchers often end up measuring things they have created themselves. And thus, they tend to infect their studies with subtle prior interpretations of the very situation they say they are measuring. And thus, when it comes to studying the family, much depends on how the question is framed. In other words, on the questioner's attitude. just like the attitude towards the half full or half empty a glass of wine. For example, if you think the natural family is a tyrannical institution and ought to be abolished, and we've already talked in our past lectures about how many people in history have made that argument, you will tend to favor family breakdown and argue that more divorce and less marriage may be healthy for society. You will therefore call a 1% increase in the divorce rate unprecedented. But if you are pro-family, you will likely argue that the difference is insignificant, considering the anti-family social forces at play, the breakdown in child discipline, the number of government programs that undermine family authority, and so on. However, I began to think, what about the basic, simple questions being asked of our citizens again and again and again and year after year? What if they consistently produce the same sort of profile? Don't we have something then? Don't we have kind of a, if not a scientifically objective measure, as in, say, physics or chemistry? We have a repeated answer to a repeated question that hasn't changed over the decades and which keeps being put to the people. So you can be sure you've hit on a basic value if you keep getting the same answers. Readers of the book here will see that there's a large gap between the people's family values and government policy on just about every value probed in this book. And this discrepancy should raise very serious questions, such as, who's running the country anyway? Or, why is there such a serious gap between national policy and national values? In a putative democracy, shouldn't the two eventually more or less equate? And the answer would seem to be yes, in a popular democracy, but no in what I call a top-down democracy, in which planners persistently strive to satisfy their ideological imperatives by introducing policies specifically designed to alter the spontaneous natural values and desires of the people. So I wanted to know to what extent this was true. And again, I spent a lot of time and money. I'm just going to hold this page of the book up so your viewers can see what I did. What I did was I went to the Gallup organization. Now, there's hundreds of polling companies, but Gallup has been around a long, long time. I don't know exactly how long. I have to go find out, but probably 60 or 70 years. And they operate in about 130 countries in the world. And often what they do is they, what's the word I'm looking for? They refine the results of their polling questions over time. And after a while, they end up arriving at certain questions which they know will always produce a reliable answer. In other words, they don't have to ask themselves if the adjectives or the adverbs in the question are turning the answer a certain way. They know that they're getting a fairly objective response from the people. That's what Gallup spends a lot of time doing. Refining their questions so they can put a lot of confidence in the answers. So it looks like I dug up 24 polls from the Gallup company. They're all footnoted and dated in what I'm going to hold up and show you in a moment. And I put the poll on the left of the page and what the state or what the government is doing on the right, in the right column. So it looks like this. There we go. If you can see that.
No, unfortunately, it's not clear enough. I cannot see.
Sorry, is that clear at all? Well, you don't have to read it, but you can see the organization.
Yes.
Polls on the left, government action on the right.
Yes.
So it made it easier for readers to see. And I'm just going to describe some of these for you, because if you're not astonished like I am, you're going to wonder why. The first one was asking people about family values, and the response, 94%, and I'm speaking about Canadians now, but these questions, they try in all sorts of countries. 94% of Canadians said they wanted more emphasis on traditional family ties in this country. So what do we have the government doing? The state pursues anti-family policies of the kind I've been outlining to your people here in the last few of our talks.
William, are we talking about 1996?
Yeah, sorry, 1993. Mm-hmm. However, I don't think it may have changed a lot, but I'm just trying to, good question. I'm trying to give you the situation as it was then. And what astonished me, which was the gap between what the people were wanting and saying and what the government was doing. Here's one that probably hasn't changed, but I can't go update all this. I mean, this took an enormous amount of effort to find all this. The people said that welfare recipients should be made to work. If they're going to take government money from us, they should be made to work. But the state has changed the old hand up philosophy to a handout philosophy. And so we end up with the welfare regime that we have today. And by the way, in my book, The Trouble with Canada, there's a whole chapter on that sticky topic. Here's another one. And I'm mentioning this because if we keep doing this together, we're going to be getting to the schools and what the schools should and shouldn't be doing. And an overwhelming majority, I'm putting this in quotes, of Canadians believe that physical education should be mandatory in the schools. 91% said that when they were asked the question, do you think physical education should be mandatory in public schools? 91% said yes, but it isn't. It hasn't been for decades. I was fortunate enough to go to a pretty basic private school when I was a young boy. And there every day at 3 o'clock, you were out on the field playing your sports or football or whatever it was, according to the season. And the only way you could get out of it was with a note from the doctor. Otherwise, sports were mandatory. And I have to say, I'm very happy about that because I love them. And then it comes to the question of schoolwork. And we'll be getting into schoolwork, as I say, in the chapters on education. What's happened to that over time? Have students gotten smarter? Have they gotten dumber? Are they more intelligent or more informed, less well-informed? What is the situation? Well, Canadians said 94% of them, these are big numbers, 94% said they wanted standardized student evaluation in public schools. And although we live in a democracy where you think the public will would have at least a little bit of force, the educational elites in this country refuse to comply. And the results show there is no standardized testing. There's lots of standardized education. Like they want to make sure that the kids learn all about woke theory and critical race theory and all these other things. And it used to be something we'll talk about down the road, which they called MVE, or moral values education, taught to them primarily by left-wingers who were trying to swing them towards moral relativism against the will of their own parents, I should say. Here's another one. Feminism was kind of becoming mainstream in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. So questions arose about feminism. 78% of Canadian women said that their family was more important than their job or career. But what does the government say about this? Well, the traditional family is almost scorned as a unit, a social unit, and government promotes career over family. It's hard not to be suspicious that one of the reasons for this is the increased tax harvest that they get from it. Another question was about preschool children. Canadians were asked, what about daycare? What about home care of children? 66% said the best place for preschool children is at home with their parents. And at the time, other questions revealed that a whopping, I'm quoting, a whopping 2/3, unquote, of Canadians opposed daycare of any kind. but the government promotes it. And once again, in Canada, the government, Trudeau, is trying to get this national daycare program off the ground, which is supposed to cost people only $10 a day per child. But this is not daycare for the truly needy, for which there may be some argument because they need assistance. But this is daycare for anybody who wants it. So a mother from a wealthy part of downtown Toronto, she can walk in with her mink coat and her tennis racket and drop her kid off for $10 a day. You know, it has nothing to do with need. Well, he hasn't quite got there yet, but other prime ministers have tried the same thing, and we'll see where this goes. It may be that the time is ripe for it, and people are not going to object to the extra taxation. Here's another one, abortion. Canadians in 1993 were asked about abortion. The people rejected abortion on demand by 75%. And 66% of physicians said they wanted legal protection for the fetus. But what's the government do? The state and 90% of the media support and promote abortion. Any Canadian or American woman can abort a baby even as late as moments before natural birth. And I have a chapter on, I call it the invisible Holocaust, about abortion, which I'd like to talk about when we get to it, because I think it's the watershed issue of our time for ideological reasons. And I will explain all that when we get to it. Anyway, all these polls, we find that the government's doing the opposite. Courts are too lenient with criminals, say 78% of Canadians. But the state promotes the modern liberal notion that society and not the individual is responsible for crime. I think that's everywhere.
William, I have a question.
Yeah.
So the people of Canada in 1993 opposed all the governmental approaches and the things that they were like pushing forward. And then they observed their governments acting against their will. What did they do about it? Did they wise up and realize that the government doesn't do what they should? Not only that, they're doing the opposite, and they bring danger and destruction on the Canadian people and the family. What was the response of the citizens?
Well, they never got a chance really to see this in my book because my book got banned. The War Against the Family got banned in Canada by some of the biggest bookstores, many of which had all sorts of publications by Marx and Engels and you know, Nazi literature. I don't know, Mein Kampf and so on. But they didn't want people to see my book. One of the reasons is that many of the staff in the stores were radical feminists and or homosexuals, you know, or both.
So they silenced your work. They didn't allow access to the public to be able to buy and read your books.
Well, it's a bit complicated. They didn't actually say they were banning my book. Oh no, we're not going to ban a book. You know, we believe in free speech and all that, but we're not going to carry his book. We're not going to sell it. Even some books, by the way, that was after the book behind me, The Trouble with Canada, surprised them all. That book became #1 in Canada 2.5 months after it was published, went into 8 printings, and people were shocked. The elites were shocked, especially the leftist elites, because they didn't know who the hell I was. Who is this guy writing this public policy book that goes against everything we believe in? But the people loved it, and they bought it in droves. And so they never had a chance to shut that one down. But my next book was The War Against the Family. And by then they knew who I was. And so even bookstore owners that were part of a chain, say, that wanted them to carry the book, well, they would find a way to hide it, put it on a bottom shelf somewhere, turn the spine away so it couldn't be seen easily, you know, that kind of thing. So that book had a big struggle. Even then, it got up to number 4 or 5 in the country. before its time it ended, But yeah, so I think your question, and I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Like, where were the people? Here's, for example, a poll asking women if they're satisfied with the domestic division of labor in their own home. 89% said yes. It's just fine, thank you. When they walk out the door and they open the newspaper, any newspaper or magazine or TV station, and what do they hear? All this radical haranguing about how, when your husband gets home, he's immediately got to change the kid's dirty diaper. Although it's not that often that the husband turns to the wife and says, I want you to take the garbage out. You know what I mean? What are we doing interfering in the private lives of married people with respect to how much work whoever does in the home? Now, I always say a marriage, running a marriage well is like flying a 747. It needs a pilot and a navigator. And I don't care which you want to do. I don't care if you switch off together, but you can't fly the plane without both. And it's the same with a marriage. It doesn't work unless both partners are cooperating. And we shouldn't stick our noses into what they're doing or not doing. But here's another one, a Gallup poll that asked if women, I'm quoting, are satisfied. Did I say that? I already said that. Oh, it's a different poll, slightly different question. Satisfied with their lives at home. And a U.S. study echoed this Canadian one, by the way. And 53% of the married women said very satisfied, not just satisfied, but very satisfied. And here's one that I thought was very telling. And I don't know, there's a chapter on daycare in this book, which I'd like to get to with you too, in which the daycare thing is exposed for what it really is. And I'm not against a little bit of daycare. I think kids should enjoy their socialization. We don't want them to be hermits and all the rest of it. But too much daycare is a real problem. And daycare centers are a real problem. Anyway, this poll asked only working women, would you quit your job if you could stay at home with your own child or children? And 79% of them said yes. And this in a country which is pushing a national daycare scheme to get women out of the home and into the workforce. And we saw in my talk on Sweden what the ideological underpinning of all that was. You see, more taxes for the state to replace family functions with state functions. And that's what happened in Sweden. And I think I already mentioned in that talk, it's not like the Swedes are anti-family. They love their children and they love their families. It's just that the government is doing almost all the stuff that they're supposed to do. And they like that too. So how do you get around this? How's it going to change? I don't know. I think the high crime rates, alcoholism rates, neurosis rates, and all that kind of stuff that you find in these overly socialized countries have a reason. And I didn't get to it on our last talk on Sweden, but something that came up in the literature was called the Nordic paradox. And that was the finding. And, these social engineers don't know what to make of it because they don't want to admit that human nature is a reality. See, the Nordic paradox is the modern finding, contemporary finding, which no one can deny, that the more equal you make the sexes in any society, the more different they will naturally want to be. In other words, once they took away, all this business of only giving boys dump trucks and only giving girls dolls and trying to change what they figured was the social conditioning, which was built into the Western family. Once they changed all that and eliminated it, what did they find? That there are more gender differences proudly worn by the Swedes than almost any other people, precisely because the government is not telling them how to behave. Everything's neutral from that point of view. Well, they say, I'm just going to be who I want to be. And that's called the Nordic paradox. If you look it up, you can follow it. It's quite interesting. Anyway, enough of the polls. I want to talk a little bit more now about the international scene. And I'm going to refer to David Popenoe, whom I mentioned last time, because he wrote that terrific book called Disturbing the Nest. And I also mentioned he's now living in Sweden, only temporarily, I think. But he shows in his book how various nations or groups within them got Swedenized, if you don't mind the expression. They got Swedenized, my term, and they tend to have the greatest family decline. For Popenoe, the modern family has weakened over a long period in several ways. It is internally less cohesive, and so its members depend less on each other. Many rely on state income transfers, and in one of my last talks, I brought up the expression economic churning. I thought it was a fascinating expression to describe the reality in a lot of these socialist countries, especially the ones that are farthest down that road, like the Nordic countries, where the wife who's going out to work opens the door for the girl who's going to come in and babysit her baby so that she can go to work in the old age home looking after that girl's mother. You see, I mean, it's crazy. If she's getting paid for looking after that girl's mother, but she doesn't get paid for looking after her own child, see? Government's looking after all that. So this is called economic churning, where there's no real productive component. It gets negated along the way. So
very destructive way, because the mothers are showing to their children that they prefer to have their career and work. So they go out to work, they leave the children behind in daycares, and then when they eventually turn old and they need the love and support of their children, the children eventually are pursuing the same route. They say to themselves, we need to take care of the career. We are going to find some Filipino who is going to take care of my elders. But it's destroying the actual bond and love relationship between the mother and the child. It will lead to a very lonely life to the elder parent.
Well, and that's why, as I mentioned in our talk on Sweden, modern Stockholm has the highest percentage of citizens living alone. I think it's 63% or something like that. So you can walk down the streets in Stockholm and say, alone, alone, alone. Every apartment you see has one person in it. It's a disaster, a disaster in the making. But are Swedes anti-family? No, they love their kids. I'm not going to say they love their wives or husbands because so few of them are getting married. They call them partners or whatever, just like we do now.
William, I want to ask a difficult question. It's a very not politically correct question. Do we really love our children anymore? Because if we are the people who are eventually becoming parents, in most cases, have no problem with abortion. They are feeding their children junk. They are throwing them at daycares. They are sending them to school, allowing them to be indoctrinated. They send them to the army to fight unnecessary wars. Where is the love to the children? It's very hard for me already to see the actual love, not just an empty statement. I don't know.
Well, I like your protest. I think it's true. People like sex, and from sex comes children. And in countries like Sweden, there's a lot of children who are born out of wedlock, as we used to say. I have a friend who calls them love children. But you're asking, is it really love? I think less so than in the past. Although, the past wasn't that perfect either. It's interesting. And when I was a young boy, as I say, I was sent away to a pretty modest boarding school for boys when I was 10 years old. I never went home again for any long period of time. Just, the typical holidays, Easter, Christmas, whatever. And it's summertime, and I thank him for it, actually. My dad, I guess, got complaints from my mom. What the hell are we going to do with two teenage boys? My brother and I. And my dad would scratch us. He said, that's your problem. You got to look after this. So God bless him, he did. he gave my brother and I a train ticket, a one-way train ticket each by day coach to Vancouver from Toronto, which is 4 days and 3 nights travel, sitting up in a chair with a little bag of canned food that we took with us. And he said, I want you to go out there and get a job. I mean, I was 15 and a half. I want you to go out there and get a job. And when you come back, you can repay me for the ticket. So we did. We walked up and down the streets of Vancouver looking for work. And we saw a sign on the door of this crummy little office. It said, Mahata River Pulp and Paper Project, now hiring. Well, my brother was 17 and I was 15, like I said. So we walked in and the first thing we saw was a sign that said, it must be over 18. So this grumpy old guy behind the counter says, okay, he says, how old are you, to my brother? And my brother says, 18, sir. And I was pretty big for 15. So he asked me, are you over 18? I said, yeah. So we ended up being shipped north to a real man's lumber camp. I'm telling you, it was real man's work. And, we came back like real men. We could swear for 5 minutes without repeating the same word. And we thought that was a great achievement. Young kids,
Yeah.
But the long and short of it is, when we got back to our school, all our friends were children. And we had become men. 10 weeks of very hard, often very dangerous work in the wild forest of North Vancouver Island. So, what were they doing? They didn't want us at home, so they sent us away. The next summer, my dad did the same thing. He said, you two got to get a job, because they didn't want us at home, I guess. So we went to Montreal. I'm giving you my memoir now. We went to Montreal, and we found a job on a British tramp steamer named the, forget the name of it now, but it was a British tramp steamer, a 10,000-ton tramp steamer. It was in such bad shape, they wouldn't even take it back to London because they would have shot it out of the harbor and sunk it. It couldn't be registered again, But it was going to the Arctic, the high Arctic, like about 1,000 miles from the North Pole, a place called Resolute Bay. And we had to load that thing up with the damnedest assortment of stuff you ever saw. I mean, cases of beer as big as my study here, which is a 10 by 14 foot room with a normal ceiling, lots of cases of beer, trucks, bulldozers, cranes, supplies, and about 8,000 barrels of high octane airplane fuel, because everybody was afraid of the Cold War then. And we had a Air Force base up there, a small Air Force base. So we were taking all kinds of supplies up to those guys who get through the winter at 50 below Celsius, So that was a crazy time. It was a crazy ship. The cook was a Polish guy, and he was just as likely to chase you around with a meat cleaver as look at you. So I'm just saying, things changed. I think when my mom and dad had kids, the whole idea was kids should be heard, kids should be seen but not heard. And you send them away to boarding school if you can afford it. And when they get home, they get a bit of mom and dad, but otherwise they get out and get world experience.
Yeah,
I couldn't do that with my kids. I wanted to raise them, and my wife and I felt the same way. So we spent a lot of time with them.
I'm sure your kids are amazing.
Oh, they're wonderful kids. I have 16 grandchildren too. So.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so it's been great. But anyway, I got off track there. But the point is, Popeno's book, if you want to read it, it's just a terrific study. It's an older study now, but these great studies, they don't get that old. And if you don't mind the immodesty, my book is a good study. I won't say great, but it's a good study, and it doesn't get old if you're prepared to accept that something that happened in 1993 is even worse now. That's about the way that goes. But it takes me back to the liberalism that was driving all this, and the remarks of a sociologist of the day back then named Roussel. And He attended a 1986 demographic conference in Ottawa, and he pointed out that while there were what he called, talk about understatement, quote, certain problems with the family in the Western world, and I thought this was honest. He said, we ought not to be surprised, for these were entirely due to developments that we had deliberately initiated, promoted, and supported ourselves. For example, near perfect contraception, so people could, quote, plan, unquote, their families. Enlightened divorce laws, so that those in intolerable marital situations could more easily be freed from them. Acceptance and encouragement of female labor force participation, so women who so wished or who found it necessary could join the workforce. This is what he was telling the audience. In other words, what we see happening all around us, as reflected in oft-cited statistics, and I've given you a few, is happening because of things we have consciously done. By we, he means the elite knowledge class, not necessarily the people. And that's what I was trying to point out when I compared the answers to the polls to the policies of our governments. They're worlds apart. We don't live in a popular democracy or anything like it. We live in a top-down statist type of democracy in which very sophisticated elites who've got all the higher degrees and the economic formation and who knows what are running the country and deciding on these policies for the people. And they're not interested in democracy because it gets in the way. They tend to get what they want done through bureaucracies of government and NGOs, like non-governmental organizations, and that kind of thing. This is like the fifth column in the democracies. These are the people who are really running things. And when we, the voters, think that we are, well, it's true that one of the great virtues of our system is we get to throw the bastards out once in a while. And that we do. We do that. So I think that's a terrific virtue and not to be sneezed at. But when it comes to actually running things day to day, it's this professional class that's doing it. And I think I mentioned before, if you go sit in the airport at Ottawa or Toronto or any major city in the world, you can spy these people walking by. They're usually very nicely dressed. They're usually carrying a black briefcase or something like that with their various government documents in it. And they usually fly first class to whatever other government meeting they're going to. You'd never catch them dead in a tourist class, or maybe only dead. At any rate, Roussel, as I said, was a committed social engineer, and he obviously approves of these changes. And his opinion was that if the social engineers, listen to this, if the social engineers don't like it, they can develop other policies to change things again. In this attitude, we clearly see, once again, the old, very old left liberal idea that man has a malleable nature as opposed to a constant nature, which is what we tend to get from the conservative wing. Human nature doesn't change. It's always been the same. Aristotle made it clear in his book on ethics and politics that human nature was then just like it is now. But liberals don't believe that. And they actually, I'm going to say they can't believe it. They can't afford to believe it, because if they did believe it, they would shoot themselves in the foot. And they wouldn't be able to bring about the policies that they want to bring about for what? Well, in my lecture on Gnosticism, I talked about that. They want to bring about the perfect kingdom of heaven on earth. It's the secularization of these expectational religions like Judaism and Christianity. In Judaism, the Messiah is yet to come. In Christianity, he's already been here, but he's coming again. That kind of thing. So the kingdom of God is an expectational objective, which once it gets secularized by people who poo-poo religion, come on, you can't believe that stuff, really. That's the kind of thing they're going to say. Nevertheless, the wiring is there in their own minds and hearts. They desperately want to perfect the world, but in the here and now. They're not going to wait till the afterlife to do any of that. Okay, so their idea is that the way to engineer the perfect society is to educate ignorant individuals, meaning the masses, meaning us, and change social institutions for its better. And I couldn't resist a bit of humor at the end of this paragraph. So I said, oh, it's good fun if you're getting paid for it, which they are. At any rate, I already talked about how Sweden is the hands-down winner for an example of how the secular welfare state openly erodes the traditional family with a vengeance. And the one thing I like about the Swedes is they never hid it. They never denied it. They said from day one, this is what we want to do. And so I say it will be the watermark to measure ourselves against, simply because Sweden's welfare state and family policies, indeed the entire Swedish radical socialist ideology, found a cozy, well-subsidized home right here in Canada. And I suspect probably many of the countries that people listening to this talk come from, it found a home there too. So in different ways, I say virtually all three mainstream political parties in Canada, we have three main ones, a few others that don't count, like, the Green Party or whatever. No one's against another tree. But the three main parties, virtually all three parties have been supporting anti-family policies, opposed to the deepest values and sympathies of the people, as I outlined in the polls that I printed here, and utterly foreign to the political, economic, moral, and religious principles on which this country was based. And I think that's probably true for your country too. See, they're opposing themselves to all the founding principles and traditions. Where possible in the United States, blacks are separated from other Americans. It's a common practice among many U.S. sociologists because the two societies are so different that if you mix them, you get neither. Otherwise, U.S. figures, when I quote them in what's coming in the rest of the chapter, include both societies. In fact, I would argue that Black America is a tragic example of how the welfare state can utterly destroy a human community of strong families if it really puts its mind to the job. Most people are shocked to learn that as recently as 1957, okay, that's a while ago, but about 75% of Black and 80% of white American families were headed by a married couple. Since then, untold billions have been lavished on the Black community in programs from President Johnson's Great Society to Nixon's War on Poverty to, you name it. In the brief space of 30 years, this was 1993, such programs amounted not to a war on poverty, but to a left liberal war on the poor of unimaginable consequences. The traditional system based on merit, which, however slowly, had been working for Black Americans, was replaced by elite-designed welfare programs offering countless economic disincentives to work and to save, and therefore moral disincentives to honor family commitments and responsibilities. Surely the biggest program in America that fell under this rubric was called the AFDC program. That acronym stands for Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Now, most of these were Black families. And what the Black women and those mothers in those families found out is that if they had a child, the government would give them a handsome check. And if they had another child, they give them another handsome check, and monthly to help them live. The only thing the government said, which would stop the checks rolling in for any number of kids that they chose to have, would be if they had a husband living at home. So what they ended up doing was telling Joe, their lover or whatever, you can come in for the weekend or Saturday night or whatever, but you got to leave because the inspector may come by and think that you're living here. Never mind the fact that half his clothes were in the cupboard and lots of food in the fridge and beer for him. But you see, the whole program was designed to undermine marriage.
William, do you have any updated statistics about how many children are now born out of wedlock in the US, for example, especially in black families?
I'm going to
I
give
think
that to
I
you.
heard 80% or something like that already.
Yeah, I'm going to give that to you shortly. That's next, and we'll go to that momentarily, because I do have some charts I printed from the book that I hope you'll be able to see. Someday, someone will demonstrate that what such quote unquote welfare programs have done to Black Americans can be fittingly compared to what Canadians have done to their own Native people. As a group, our Native populations have a far higher single parent rate, about 27% back then, welfare dependency rate, and homicide, alcoholism, and suicide rate than any other Canadian group, and they are the most thoroughly Swedenized of all. For example, homicide in Canada, we know how many homicides there are every year. They're not a lot, but the Native population of Canada is about 4.5%, and they commit about 20% of all homicides. You know, Native males mostly doing this. Most violent crime is male crime. It is here that we must look for explanations, simply because there are a great many other social groups in the world with far worse economic conditions than theirs, yet who have close-knit family values and social statistics. So that's where we are in terms of this chapter. But now I'd like to close by showing you a few charts that I think are especially interesting, and then I'll have to read to you what I said about the chart underneath. Here's a chart that I called Fleeing Marriage. It shows the median age at marriage of brides and bridegrooms. And that's only a person who's never previously married. It doesn't talk about second or third marriages and all that. From 1940 to 1988, so that's a 48-year period. And almost all these charts are more acute today. So I'm going to put it this way. This is the chart, daisy, showing age at first marriage. So this is here we go. Come on, Bill. You can do it. Okay. So this is 1940 here on your left. And you can see that the age of marriage was very high then. The black line, the dark line is males and the light line is females. And the age of marriage is on the right bar. But you can see that people got married at a fairly late age then. And then by the middle of the graph, we're into the sorry, I got it wrong, didn't I? Okay. By the middle of the graph, we're into the war years and economic prosperity and coming out of the kind of thing that made marriage difficult for young couples in the early part of the last century, which was basically, very strong family ties and fathers who simply did not give permission for their daughters to marry guys who couldn't support them properly or support a family. No, you could go out and get a better job, get better pay, work another couple of years, and then come and see me again, that kind of thing. So, but that was the reason for the high age of marriage in the early part of the century. The reason now is quite different. It's postponement of marriage for careers. It's the fact that sexual pleasure is so available without marriage, whereas back then it was pretty tough to get unless you wanted to take a chance of getting sexual disease or something. So there was a tremendous sexual premium that came with legitimate marriage. And now all that's gone. Girls are acting like guys, chasing them down for sex. I'm not saying it's rampant, but it's even happened to me. So, very unusual back in the day. Daughters were told, you don't call the guy, he's going to call you, right? Here's how you behave on a date and all that kind of stuff. And if he wants to marry you, you can come and have to talk to me first. It still happens, but only with young men who really respect tradition and so on. Here's a chart showing non-marital births in the bars, and government expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product. So the bars are the non-marital births, and you can see them going up over the years, tracking government expenditures. I'm not saying one causes the other, but I have a hard time not seeing a cause. Because when governments spend more, taxing more and spend more, they make family life more difficult, married life more difficult. And also, these modern welfare state governments tend to take away the marriage premium and the child premium. Like when my mom and dad got married, excuse me, they were allowed to split their incomes before taxation. So I'm picking a number, but suppose my dad earned $50,000 on the tax form for my mother, he would put in 25 for her and 25 for him. So they both got taxed at a lower rate because they were a married couple. With feminism, all that's gone now. Oh, no, you women have to go out and earn just like men. Be an independent economic unit was the thinking. And that's what's happened. Now when it comes to what a man named Ben Wattenberg, an American writer who wrote a book, excuse me, I'm going to cough again. He wrote a book called The Birth Dearth in the 1980s. All you need to do is read it and then just crank up the numbers a little bit to get where we are today. The book talks about the total fertility rate, or the TFR, from 1945 to 1989. And there you can see it. Total fertility rate is up here, and it starts to come down mid-century, and here's where it is today. So I'll just give you the numbers. In 1945, for example, it was 3.5 children per woman. And we know that every woman has to have, women and gender, we need 2.1 children per woman. That's a silly thing to say because a woman can't have 0.1 of a child. But when you do the statistics, it works out to 2.1 children for every woman in the country in order to maintain your population. And these measures are called total fertility rate measures. Where are we today? Well, the dotted line across the bottom here that you see, that's the 2.1 line. And you can see we've been under it since 1970 in Canada, and I think in many other countries. And over here, I put a little arrow to show where we are today, which is at 1.509 children per woman in 2020.
So that's basically the end of Canada, unless you allow the immigration of incompatible cultures into the country.
You said it better than I could say it, and this is what happened. And that's why we've had leaders, starting with Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, who famously said in public, it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from. Now, this is completely false. I'm the first one to say you're going to find wonderful immigrants from any culture. It happens, but it doesn't mean they're all wonderful. And even if they were, it doesn't mean that what they're wonderful about, like their idea of politics, their idea of religion, their idea of culture, their idea of the arts, their idea of sexual relations, their idea of any number of things, is going to be compatible with the historical traditions and institutions of your country. Why do we think that doesn't matter? I don't know. But that's how it started, with Pierre Trudeau saying it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from. And now his son has taken it even farther with the ridiculous idea that Canada is the world's first, get the phrase, post-national state. Well, he means nationalism. The idea of the nation state is gone, is completely gone. And that's why open immigration is just great. Let's bring them in from everywhere. It's all going to be wonderful. Well, in my Trouble with Canada book, Trouble with Canada Still, which was published in 2010, I spent a bit of time trying to explain the difference between deep culture and what I call skin deep culture. Now, skin deep culture is like, sushi, French movies, Italian cars, German shoes, I don't know, movies, any number of these things. You can think of them as skin deep culture. And we all enjoy them. We go to a part of the city where these things exist, and we say, oh boy, there's a Chinese restaurant, let's go eat. Or there's a Japanese sushi, let's go eat. Or there's a French movie, let's go see the famous French movie, or something like that. So that's fun. But that's very different from deep culture. Deep culture has to do with language, first of all, religion, politics, institutions, literature, all these things which are part of what really has formed the people, or the natus, as they say in Latin. Natus refers to being born in a certain with a certain culture, race, ethnicity, or country, and that's where we get the word nation state from. They tend to be formed around ethnic groups, and once you start internationalizing all this, you can expect a lot of trouble, a lot of expenses. I was in the hospital last week, like I said, getting a pacemaker, and I couldn't help noticing this hospital had they are saints, wonderful people. But, I had an Indonesian nurse, a Russian nurse, a Hungarian nurse, a German doctor. The whole thing. The whole display of multiculturalism was there in that hospital. And they were wonderful people doing a great job. And I think every modern nation needs some of that. But that's different from a kind of cultural invasion or a diminution of the core culture of the nation, which immediately starts to happen when you start emphasizing these multicultural thrust. You tend to be bringing in lots of people, not only who aren't going to agree with your deep culture, but don't want to agree. We have our own deep culture, thank you very much, and that's what we love more than your deep culture. And we're going to, we're going to promote it. So Statistics Canada told us in 1990 that there were 6 or 8 ethnic enclaves in Canada, according to their own census. They called them ethnic enclaves. We have one just south of where I live. It's a Muslim village called Peace Village. They have all their mosques in there and their Muslim schools and this and that, pretty much keep to themselves. But there were 6 or 8 of them in the 1990s. As of 2010 census, they said there were 265 ethnic enclaves in Canada. And I don't know where you and your listeners come from, but you probably got them there too, to say the least. So the issue is the nation state going to survive? I'm going to call it a ethnic and cultural invasion, which is being brought about by internationalists, brought up in the Enlightenment tradition, that man with a capital M, which means all people, is not sexual, is all that matters. It doesn't matter where they come from, as Trudeau says. And these people tend to be running things through NGOs, bureaucracies, international organizations, the UN, things like that. There's our Trudeau. He ran off to try to get a seat on the UN Security Council, and he didn't. But that's what he tried to do. Let me show you another graph here. This is a graph showing the share of after-tax personal income in constant dollars, which is left in your hands, and graphed against total government expenditure as a share of gross domestic product. So here's what you have left in your hands over the years after these decades of increased taxation, and this is government spending as a share of GDP. Now, I'm not going to say there's a direct relationship here, but it's a sufficiently strong indirect relationship that I think it's a cause.
William, and I'm sure that the graph doesn't show the unfunded liabilities and all the debt for next generation, and I'm sure it doesn't take into consideration the inflation, the hidden tax, right?
That's right. And that gets you into what they call bracket creep, pushing you into a higher tax bracket, even though you haven't really earned more money, that kind of thing. So, yeah, this is big. Now, children, you asked about children born to unmarried parents as a percentage of all births. So here's this chart from the book. And you'll notice here, these are, we got Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland, all of them socialist empires where the greatest number of children are born out of wedlock. And up here in the more traditional countries, the fewest. What's the situation today? I just checked it. The OECD tells us that, I'll just read in my note first. I said, with few exceptions, this chart illustrates well the anti-family consequences of statism. The nations most devoted to socialist ideals experience the greatest illegitimacy, atomization of the family unit, and corresponding dependency of individuals on the provider state. Canada on this chart, by the way, was right about here with Austria. So not as bad as the outright socialist countries, but worse than many of the others. So I checked more recent numbers, and the OECD tells us that in 1970, the figure was 7%, averaging all countries in the world. 7% of children were born to unmarried parents. In 1995, the figure was 24%, and in 2018, 41%. And now the point is, of course, that some of these are much higher. For example, Chile or Mexico, about 70% of all children are born outside of marriage. The parents just don't bother. What are the best countries from this point of view, which have their children within marriage? Japan and Greece are both less than 10%. And I don't need to talk now because I think we're pretty much done for today of the difference between married and unmarried couples when it comes to stability. And we know in Canada, for example, in the US and many other democracies, unmarried couples have I hate the word, a dissolution rate many times higher than married couples do. Married couples that have troubles, they tend to try to talk it out, work it out, keep the marriage together and so on. But unmarried couples tend to dissolve way much easier and faster and sooner than married couples do. So,
do you have the numbers by race, for example? In the US, let's say white families compared with Mexican families, compared with black families?
Not right at hand, but it is somewhere in my book, and I'll try to dig it up for next time. The black family has been devastated by welfarism. Now, the best place to see that story is in a book by Charles Murray called Losing Ground, in which he examines the welfare policies that were brought into America in a very hopeful way. And the AFDC program that I mentioned earlier was part of that. It basically subsidized women for not getting married. And that's what happened. So I think the figure now is something like 70, 80% of black children born outside of marriage in America. As I say, you can't mix them.
That's the Great Society. That's what you get when government.
Yeah, the Great Society. In Canada, Trudeau called it his just society. Wow. Well, he was a lawyer, so.
It's insane. And it's very sad. It's breaking my heart. 80%. Wow.
Yeah, big. And anyway, by the way, I would say not only is that sad, but what's sad is the attitude towards it. Now, a lot of people today, they'll have their child first and then get married, if they get married at all. It's not like they see any shame in it or any order that has to be observed.
Yeah.
And
yet a single mother today is a warrior. It's an example to be followed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I think you said that you need to finish up.
Yeah, I think probably I should.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would like to say is thank you very much for coming. It's always a huge delight to have you here. Would you be patient enough, like to take 1 or 2 questions before you leave? Or
Yeah, let's do that. Sure.
okay, so I'm going to unmute. Hi. 1 second. Go ahead, friend. Hi.
Oh, sorry. Hi, William. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, if you speak slowly, it's better because my speaker is not 100%.
No problem. Obviously, I live in and around London, England, and I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are about the the destruction of the family in Western societies, because I've been looking at a lot of statistics lately, and I just come to the conclusion that the destruction of the family unit seems to be aimed at Western countries, particularly white people who are native to their land. It's almost as if that they're trying to make it difficult for white families to have babies. And then what they're doing is they're then getting replaced with immigration from places like, Africa, the Middle East, and places like that. So from my calculations, probably in around about the next 400 to 500 years, the white population would probably be down to about, it's 800 million at the moment. It'd probably be down to about 50 million. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't think we really know where it's going to be because stuff happens, as you know. We didn't know Putin was going to invade Ukraine, but he did. No one expected a third world war, which we may be heading towards. So it's difficult to predict the future from the present, I have to say, but that's what you're trying to do. And what do I think of that? I think it's true that there's been an attempt on the part of intellectuals and authorities to dilute the white race everywhere in the world with immigration from non-white countries. And I got in trouble when I wrote the Trouble with Canada book behind me, because I argued that if the people as a whole wanted to do that, that should be up to them. We could hold a referendum. We could say, here's the pie. Here's what percentage of our population is white, black, green, whatever it is, Asian, whatever, I'm not mocking any of this. I'm just saying we know what the ethnic divisions in the country are and how many there are. Here's the pie. So I think we should go to the people and say, would you like to keep the pie exactly like it is? Even if we bring in more immigrants, we're not going to change the balance between these these races and ethnicities. Would you like to do that? Or do you want to bury yourself with somebody from the slice of the pie that's X or Y or Z? Do you want to do that? And now it's very interesting how people don't know how to answer these questions. I have a very dear black friend. I first met him when he was 19, and I was the Canadian 400-meter hurdling champion. And he walked across the track to me and asked me if I could help him. And I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, I want to be a hurdle champion like you. And I said, sure, I don't have anyone to run with, so I'll take you under my wing just fine. Well, he was a fatherless black boy from Jamaica, where a lot of young boys have no fathers. They have fathers, but they've gone. They leave. They run around, take up with other women, whatever, and they don't support their children or the mothers of their kids. It's way too rampant. But I asked him because, of course, he loves Jamaica, where he came from at the age of 9. He still thinks that's a nice country, and he goes back once in a while. But I said to him, his name is Hamlin. I said, Hamlin, how would you feel if an immigration program was started in Jamaica such that after, say, 30 or 40 years, Jamaica was majority white? And maybe in 100 years, 90% white. Would you, because he's a big promoter of multiculturalism policy. I said, would you accept that? Do you think that would be a good idea? He says, no. He said, I don't want that to happen. I said, well, that's all I'm saying. And in a democracy, you'd think you'd go to the people, tell them these are the splits of the pie, ethnic splits of the pie. Do you want to change your country? And I don't own the country, so if the majority of people in Canada said, sure, let's change it, let's become a post-national state, like Trudeau says, I love that idea. Well, I'd probably argue against it, but I wouldn't fight it in the sense of, taking up arms or something. But the people were never asked. And this is part of what I've been trying to outline in all my talks, is that the people are not asked if they want to keep the ethnic composition of their country the same. And the message that's being given to us by governments is that we have no control over it, whereas in fact we do. We control, 100% control who gets to come into the country and who doesn't. There are immigration offices in all the countries that send immigrants to Canada. And there's immigration offices here. We have all the numbers. So who gave the Canadian government the authority to dilute the ethnic balance of this country, which had been historically what it was for 200 years? Who gave them that authority? Not the people. People were never asked. So then the question is, who was it? Well, go to your local university, a sociology department or something, and you'll find out who it was. Or the law department. People writing these turgid articles about one world, one people, internationalism, and all that kind of thing, or post-national state. That's what's happened. It did not come from below; it came from above.
It's really interesting you say that, William, because I read a report somewhere that by 2066, the amount of children born in this country, so white native English people, will be equaled by the immigration births. So it'd be the same. And I've read somewhere that if the ethnic natives is below 50%, so for example, if there are 50% white English children being born and 50% immigrant children being born, there is no way to reverse that. The only way down is effectively the ethnic white English children being born out of existence. There's no way to return that. Apparently a healthy balance, and quote me if I'm wrong, is 70-30. So you could have 30% of the country being ethnic and 70% of the country being, the natives, if you like. But I don't know if that's correct.
That's probably correct. And I think sociologists would tell you that once you go over a number like that, whether it's 80-20 or 70-30, I don't know, but once you go beyond a number like that, you're pushing the limits, and you can expect pushback and trouble from the native population, the historical population of the country. You can expect pushback. By the way, some of this is referred to in the political literature as the revenge of the cradle. So, Muslims, for example, in Canada know that if their women have 3 or 4 children each, and we're only having 1.05, whatever that figure was that I showed you, they're going to win the war for a population. And eventually
conquer the nation with their wombs.
You got it. Now, something we don't see a lot of, and I don't know why, is that there are population centers, study groups, like at, I think, Columbia University. I think that's the last one I saw. Anyway, well-renowned scholars and groups who study world populations. And I saw some scary figures there where they, and I can't, I'm not going to quote it because I don't exactly remember the wording, but it was something like this, that by the year 2060, the population of Italy, for example, would be reduced by 20 or 30 million, 20 million anyway, compared to what it is today. So you can see the intersection of that reality, which we're getting out of the total fertility rate. That's where that's coming from. Not having our own babies, bringing in immigrants who are not compatible with our culture, religious beliefs, language, literature, values in general, whatever, which is very dislocating. So we've really been asking for trouble, if you ask me, and we're getting it. But I think when the great die-off comes, and I'm part of that, I'm almost 82 now. So the great die-off will include people like me born during and just after the Second World War, which was a massive bump in the population. When that die-off, it's already started. I know because some of my friends have died already. And when that great die-off, I call it, when that happens, believe me, the apartment buildings and the storefronts are going to be a lot emptier than they are now. Who's going to lease them? What's going to happen to those buildings, apartment buildings, office buildings, when 20 million people disappear over a 30-year period? Right? Nobody's asking the question, it seems, or if they are, they're keeping it quiet. I don't see much on it.
Yeah. Thank you. William, I would like to let you go. I know it's been long enough. The most important thing is thank you that you're okay and safe and healthy. And please make sure you remain like that. Remain healthy, please.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for this amazing presentation as usual. And I hope to see you next Wednesday, right?
Yes, sir. Okay, you take care. You take care.
Okay. Guys, you're welcome to say thank you to William if you like. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, William.
Thank you.
Thank you, William.
Thank you. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you very much.
God bless you and see you next time.
Okay.
The floor is open for free conversation on anything you like.
Sorry, because I came in a bit late. What was William talking